Sons of the Revolution are descendants of about 5% of the American population that risked their lives for American independence. You know, these were the guys who froze and starved and got sick and got shot at and didn't get paid very much for doing this. And who were these people? Were militia who came and went from the various states, but in the Continental Army, if you look at the various demographics of these various units and whatnot, a high percentage of them were Irish. I would say overall, approximately by my guesstimates, which is not necessarily historic, but a lot of the records are lost, about 30% of the Continental soldiers who walked the walk and took the risks were of Irish descent. 2/3 of the soldiers, American soldiers who died in the war, died in New York in the prisons and the prison ships. You had about an 80% chance of dying if you were in a British prison. Many of those were Irishmen. Of course, then there were the first and second generation Irishmen who participated in this. There are three people that one should remember as great heroes of the Revolution. One that Arthur asked me to mention is Hercules Mulligan, who most people haven't heard of, but whom William Casey thought should be in a statue rather than made in hail, because Hercules Mulligan was an effective spy. He actually got it done. He was one of the original Sons of Liberty, starting in 1765. He recruited Alexander Hamilton to the cause. He was one of the people who tore down the statue of King George after the Declaration of Independence was read.
That was right here in the middle of the park.
He stayed behind during the 7 years of the British occupation, was a tailor to the British officers and fed intelligence to Washington, and as the story goes, saved him from being captured on a couple of occasions. Two other people to mention, John Barry, who's from Wexford. He's the father of the American Navy. John Paul Jones gets all the press, and he was notorious at the time, but the guy who actually served a much greater role, had more victories, was John Barry. And the third guy is Gustavus Cunningham. He's known as the Pirate of Dunkirk, and he just terrorized the British around the British Isles, and he was the one guy. These are three heroes that everybody ought to know about.
Yeah, about 4 months ago, we were here at this very spot to raise a flag for Evacuation Day. Evacuation Day was the final triumph of the American Army over the British. And I also think that St. Patrick's Day is also in many ways represents a day of triumph, and that's the triumph of the Irish. Now, although there were, as Ambrose has pointed out, Irishmen in the Revolution, it really wasn't. New York was mostly Protestant, and mostly until around the turn of the around 1800, when things got much worse in Ireland, and there was a tremendous emigration from Ireland because of the discrimination against Catholics, and ultimately the ultimate was the famine. And thus, almost 1 million people came, 1 million Irish came to the United States, and many of them came here to New York. And at first, things weren't much better than they were in Ireland. They were discriminated against, they were poor, they had no one to take care of them, many of them didn't speak English. And the question was, what was the church going to do? The church was divided until in about the 1840s. They appointed a man named John Hughes to be the archbishop. And Hughes, in his very first sermon at Mott Street, said to the Irish immigrant poor, "We will stand up and we will fight anti-Catholic prejudice. And if we stay together and we're unified, we will be much more powerful. Like the early Christians who were poor, we will soon prevail." And Hughes thus allied himself with a strange political organization called Tammany Hall, and they began to gain a toehold in the police department, in the fire department, in the city government in the 1850s. And by 1858, they said they would build a great cathedral up on Fifth Avenue on the outskirts of the city. And people said, well, it's just the outskirts, but you said, but one day it'll be the center, and we will be at the center. And so Hughes, of course, didn't fully live to see it, but under the great Tammany leaders, John Kelly, Richard Croker, and Charles Francis Murphy. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of them, but but for 60 years they more or less ran the city of New York. And the Irish became much more powerful, and there were Irish mayors, and ultimately under Murphy, the great Charles Francis Murphy, there was the great Irish politicians Al Smith, Jimmy Walker, and people said that the Irish ran New York. So just as Hughes predicted, they were not anymore a fringe group on the side, and they were not poor, but they were at the very center of the city, and they showed the great power, and that was the great triumph of the Irish and the triumph of St. Patrick's Day. And for that reason, it's great to hear, and that triumph would be repeated by other ethnic groups like the Jews and the blacks through the kingdom. So the Irish, in a sense, showed the way, and I think St. Patrick's Day, just like Evacuation Day, is a day of triumph, and we should celebrate that. Finally, and most importantly today, Patrick Lynch, President of the PATROLMEN'S Benevolent Association.
You know, we just heard a great history of Irish Americans coming to this country, Irish immigrants, the sons of the revolution, part of making this country free, having those battles that we needed to have, and the wars that came after as well to protect our rights, to stand on a corner like this and say what we believe, to go to a church and worship as we believe, without fear of being retaliated against, without fear of being attacked. So that great history also led into the police department. While we had soldiers fought here on these streets, it's police officers that through the years and today preserve that peace. We're not soldiers, but we're police officers. And we protect the right for folks like us to stand here and talk about some history we just heard. Protect our rights to raise a flag. For an Irish American like myself, I'm so proud of our heritage, but I'm more proud of my country as we stand here between these two flags. So we should remember each and every day while business goes on, we became the capital of the world, and these streets that we stand on our right and our left, lead the world, not just our city, not just our country. But we should remember that the police officers that stand around us, although we're not all Irish Americans, we're Cuban Americans, we're Latinos, we're Italian Americans, Germans, Turkish. All those police officers now stand here to protect our rights. The work that started here will continue on. We'll stand here and protect every face with every opinion, regardless of what they look like. That's what New York City police officers do. So I ask us, as we stand here, these police officers in uniform who are protecting my rights, let's give them a round of applause.